So hello everyone, this is the update video where I will discuss the slides that have changed from last year. So if you have watched the other videos already, you have seen this person with like the lockdown hair explaining you the slides, which are still pretty much the same as this year's slides. I just decided to update last year's slides in a couple of instances, and those I will discuss right now. Okay, let's take a look. Let me share the slides. 1 second. Here we are. Yeah, so this is kind of where we discuss the instrumental variable methods. Yeah, so this has not been part of the lecture slides from last year. And this is a simple example. This is actually taken from the book by Enquist and Pischke, Mostly Harmless Econometrics. Yeah, so this is also a very nice book. That is quite different from the Wooldridge panel data book. Yeah? So this book is extremely influential for applied people. It's actually also very nicely written. It's sort of funny even. Whereas Wooldridge has written the Bible. It's like this super big book that contains absolutely everything. And Wooldridge is mathematically, I would say, quite a bit more precise. Yeah? However, Enquist and Pischke do an extremely good job in getting across the intuition behind these methodologies. So therefore, we take a look at a very simple example, which is a classic of omitted variable bias. Yeah, so let's say, for instance, you want to see what is the effect of an additional year of education on the log of wage. Now, first remark, why would we normally take the log of wage? Well, one reason is that the salary distribution is extremely skewed. So there's a big bulk of people that make like a normal salary, I would call. But as we all know, there is also like these type of managers that make a lot of money, a lot of money. And so the distribution is quite skewed. And the log is sometimes taken to get rid of that skew. Moreover, it's not the same kind of the jump from 2 years to 3 years of education as the jump from 14 to 15 years of education. Yeah. And if we were not to take the log, but rather take simply a linear model, then of course this would implicitly assume that the jump across the years is always the same, right? If it from 4 to 5 years is the same effect as from 20 to 21 years of education. So we don't think that is very reasonable, and we prefer the percentage change interpretation. And therefore, we take the log of wage here. Okay, so now let's say we have the true model. That's the long regression. Yeah, that's what we see here, where we have the log of wage, and then we take here the years of education, and then we have A, which simply captures ability, whatever that is, right? You can say ability is motivation, intelligence, whatever. Put whatever you want in there. Now, in this long regression, in this equation here, we can safely assume that the years of education and the model error, these two variables are uncorrelated. Yeah? And why do we say this? Well, because in this long regression, we make an apples to apples comparison. So for instance, if we fix two individuals that have the same ability, but one individual, or like actually we fix all the individuals have the same level of ability, which is implicitly what is done by linear regression, right? We compare individuals that have the same level of ability, but that differ in their level of education. Then it is pretty reasonable that whatever we get for the level of education is actually a causal estimate, right? Because we keep ability fixed by including it in the regression. So statistically, we keep ability fixed and only change the level of education. And whatever effect we see on the log wage is reasonably a causal effect. Okay, so this kind of causal interpretation for EI would be reasonable in the long regression. However, we talk about omitted variables. Ability is typically not observable. And actually, it's not even clear what ability really means. I mean, I said intelligence, motivation, how would you even measure that, right? You don't see it. So let's say we just say, okay, let's ignore it. We ignore ability and we estimate the short regression. Now, this is a super simple model. So we only have one explanatory variable EI. And therefore, we have the simple formula from a bivariate regression, meaning that the least squares estimator of this variable will converge to this, just the covariance of log wage and education divided by the variance of the level of education. So very simple. Now, what's the next step in order to see whether this thing is consistent? Well, this y will this y will be replaced by the true y, right? So by this thing, because this is actually what generates the data. Yeah, so let's plug it in. We get this, and well, then we just take apart the numerator. So again, so this is constant and the random variable. The covariance is of course 0. Then here we have the covariance of a constant times E and E, which is simply the constant comes out, and the covariance of E and E is of course the variance. And again, this covariance here is 0 because we are talking about the model error from the long regression, from this one, right? Okay. So what do we get? In the end, what we get is that the limit of beta 1 hat is the true beta 1 that we want, plus this term here. And this is the omitted variable bias in the simple case where we have only like one explanatory variable and one omitted variable. And this bias has actually a very nice form, which is quite intuitive. So kind of if you look at this term here, the covariance, so this term here, this is simply a regression coefficient, right? You would get this in the limit if you were simply to regress A on E. So A would be the response variable and E the explanatory variable. Okay, so this expression therefore contains some insight. For instance, we actually do not have any omitted variable bias if, for instance, beta 2 is 0. What does that actually mean? Well, if you go back to the long regression, this thing is 0, which means that ability actually has no effect on the log wage. Yeah, of course, this is not quite realistic, but in that case, we would not have any omitted variable bias. And the next thing is that if this covariance here between A and E is 0, meaning that there's no correlation between ability and the level of education, again, estimating the model, the short model, where we simply ignore ability, would give you a consistent estimator of the effect of the years of education. Now, however, in reality, it is reasonable to assume that beta 2 is actually larger than 0 because higher ability typically means that you make a higher wage, so on average at least. Plus, and this is something that, of course, people at university like to believe, higher ability also leads to higher level of education, right? Now, if we have both these things together, then it's very clear that this is positive, this thing will be positive, the variance is always positive. So the estimator of the years of education would converge to the true number, the true effect, plus some positive bias. And therefore, we would typically in practice overestimate the effect of education because we sort of some part of ability is falsely attributed to your education. Yeah, so that's sort of the reason here. Okay, so that's a very simple example. Then, well, I mean, just a remark here, ability is in our example a confounding variable. Yeah, so kind of confounding variable is basically, okay, so let me just explain it with shaking hands, right? So there is the y variable. So this has some variation, and there's the explanatory variable. And what we want for causality is that we shake this and we see something shake here. And because everything else is fixed, this shaking is causing this shaking. So this is really what we mean by causality. Everything else, the universe is completely stable. Only this thing changes. And as a result, this thing changes. That's causality. And the confounding variable is a variable that gets sort of in between. It's up here, right? And what happens is that if I check the confounder, also the response changes. And moreover, this is bad enough, but it gets really bad because if I change the explanatory variable, I shake this one, this will induce a shake in this one, yeah, and therefore this will of course shake, yeah, the response, but you don't know anymore. Is it the variation here, or is it the variation here that is causing the variation here? And this is a confounding variable, and this destroys our causal interpretation. Yeah, okay. Now there is so this stayed the same, and now there is some examples of instrument in the old lecture. However, I have decided to kind of give a little bit more detail here. So this is an update on those slides. Of course, talking about this example, right? Education is endogenous if you want to explain wages. And a famous paper by David Card, now Nobel laureate since last year, he has an instrument called college proximity. So kind of whether you grew up next to a college town. And it's very clear that if you grow up next to a university town, it's more likely for you to actually attend college because, well, for instance, if you can still live at your parents and go to university, and the cost is much lower. Now, this is the relevance, yeah. So kind of growing up close to a university increases the chance of attending university. That's the relevance. And regarding the validity, this is of course the difficult part. The validity, again, always remember, validity can only be tested to a very limited extent in GMM. For validity, you normally really have to make an argument why this instrument leads to exogenous variation in the endogenous variable. Okay, now here in this particular paper, well, the argument is very simple. Card says, well, look, the birthplace is random. You don't choose your birthplace. You don't choose where you grow up. Therefore, there's no self-selection close to university towns. However, you can criticize this. Well, there may be different channels through which this instrument actually has an effect on wages. And so, for instance, let's say kind of people like parents that have a very high affinity to education. So people that really care about the level of education of their children, those tend to move close to university, for instance, if that is the case. Plus, these parents also produce kids with higher education because, again, education is really important for them. So they train their children to attend, to get a high level of education. In this particular case, there is the family background. This is a variable, and the instrument has an effect on wage through family background. It is not necessarily because, like, you exogenously attend college because you grow up close to college. No, it's your family background that has an effect on the wage. Okay, so this would be an argument against the validity. Now, another famous example, actually also Angrist, another really famous name, also now Nobel laureate, has also gotten the Nobel Prize together with David Card and Guido Imbens from the Netherlands. Yeah, so what do they look at? They look at the effect of fertility, meaning having children, on labor market supply. Now, of course, for many people, having children is a conscious decision. And those decisions, they typically are related to other characteristics of the parents. So let's, for instance, say you have people that are very career-minded, they are very career-driven. Those people are normally happy to postpone their fertility and maybe even have less children in order to kind of, have a better career. So therefore, the decision of having children is related to other variables that may be unobservable, the parents' motivation, for instance, and that other variable, motivation, has an effect on the labor market supply. So we have kind of endogeneity, very classic, something hidden in the error term, motivation of the parents, that is correlated with the explanatory variable fertility, and that hidden thing has an effect on labor market supply. Very classic endogeneity. So now what do the authors do? Well, they have a clever instrument, which is called gender composition. So they look at the first two children and they look is it boy, boy, girl, girl, or is it a mix? And the idea here is that they show that many parents actually prefer to have children of both genders. So they want to have a boy and a girl. And if you, for instance, happen to have two girls or two boys, you're more likely to have a third child, because you want to have one of the other gender. Now, this is, of course, the relevance part, right? Yeah, so this makes this gender composition variable correlated to fertility, because the same gender increases your chance of having another child. So there's the correlation. And the authors then argue, look, the sex of the child is random. Really, there's no choice of the parents that can influence that, at least as most people would argue. I don't know what is the current state of science in that area. Yeah, so therefore also the exclusion restriction should hold, because like there's no choice involved. It's absolutely random. Therefore, what other channel would there be? Okay, and here's something that you will always see whenever there's a good instrument, people jump on it, everyone uses it, and then some critics come up and try to kind of make that instrument into a bad instrument. And so for instance, some people say that the sex ratio actually affects the budget constraint. So for instance, if you have a boy and you have another boy, you can use the same clothes, you can use the same toys, you can use whatever again. If you have a girl, then you have to maybe buy stuff in pink. I wouldn't do that, but nevertheless, many people do. Now, you have to decide for yourself whether this is strong criticism. So how much bias would this sort of criticism actually induce into the instrument, the variables estimator? Instruments are a delicate matter. There's always some part of it that, since it cannot be tested, the validity condition, you have to find a good argument that is convincing to many people, and some people will not be convinced. So that's just the state of the world. Okay, then we have another paper, which is also quite interesting because you kind of look at property values, and you want to see what is the effect of riots on property value. And well, I mean, you would of course expect that riots are not precisely good for the value of your house. However, this is surprisingly tricky to estimate, because if you look at where riots appear, then you will find that typically it's not the very posh neighborhoods, but rather often neighborhoods in which the property values are in any case low, right? Now, of course, if you were then simply regressing property value on riots, you would compare the posh neighborhoods to the bad neighborhoods, because in the posh neighborhoods, no riot, bad neighborhood, lots of riot, and you would kind of attach the loss in property value simply to riot. But that's of course not the case. It's not the riot that makes that neighborhood like bad necessarily, right? There's other things. There's bad schools, there's bad infrastructure, whatever, which of course play a role for the property value. Now, these authors, they use rainfall as an instrument, and rainfall has been used so many times, it's a meme. So they use rainfall a very clever way. So there were riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King. However, apparently there were less riots when in a particular neighborhood it was raining. So people are very mad, but they're either less mad when it's raining, or at least they're kind of less likely to take their anger to the street. Yeah, so now this is again the relevance, right? So yes, so rainfall is correlated with the probability of a riot. That's the relevance. And again, the argument for the validity is randomness. So they say rainfall is random. There's no choice. No one can choose the rain. And therefore, there should be no other channel through which this instrument affects the property value. Now, randomness is often not enough. Yeah? So you have to be also a little bit careful. Even when your instrument is perfectly random, you have to, for instance, make sure that this instrument is then not sort of correlated with what you were actually looking at. So for instance, if rainfall is more likely in bad neighborhoods, then you again have like similar problems. Then this may induce a bias into your IV estimates. I just said it, like randomness of rainfall makes it extremely popular, for instance, in the migration literature. Yeah, rainfall or the lack of rainfall can be a severe push factor for migration, and that's why it's so popular. Now, for instance, you look at economies, typically in Africa, that rely heavily on agriculture, and lack of rainfall can have really severe economic consequences. And well, famous study used rainfall as an instrument of income shocks. Yeah, so kind of like probability of conflict. Now, here you have an issue of reverse causality, right? You don't know what comes first. Is it like the lower income that increases the probability of conflict, or is it the other way around? Once there's a conflict, of course, income drops. Yeah? So wherever there's a civil war, don't expect the economy to work well. On the other hand, if income has a negative shock, people get really mad at their government and the probability of conflict increases. So there is a severe problem here of reverse causality, and we try to break that by using an instrument. Yeah? So for instance, we want to shake income without shaking the probability of, we want to shake income in such a way that the model error basically stays constant, all these other things. Okay, now we try to do this by rainfall, and a particular criticism is here that rainfall does not only affect the civil conflict through income. Rainfall has been used so much that other studies have shown that rainfall is, affecting tax revenue, capital investment, risk preferences, population size, whatever, right? Rainfall is correlated to so many things that you have to be really careful when you use this as an instrument. Yeah, so for instance, if you look at probability of conflict, which is your response variable, and you want to use rainfall as an instrument for income shocks, and you do not account for all these things. So all these things here would be hidden in the error term. You have a problem because rainfall is related to income shocks. However, there's other stuff, other omitted variables, for instance, let's say tax revenue, hidden in the error term, and rainfall is also moving this thing. Yeah? And therefore, the validity condition or the exclusion restriction is probably violated in this case. Okay, so another example, super famous, again, George Angrist. He wants to check what is the effect of military service on wage. Yeah? Wages are extremely interesting to economists, of course. Now, the problem is, again, that joining the military is not at random, right? You don't go to the population and say, you go to the military, you don't, and this kind of stuff. You don't do that. Military is a conscious choice, and this choice may be related to unobserved individual characteristics, which also have an effect on wages. Another problem is that, for instance, in the US, not everyone can actually join the military. For instance, you have to have, I think you have to do an IQ test and this kind of stuff. Yeah? So kind of joining the military is really attached to many things that are related to ability. And as we know, ability, this really weird concept, has a strong effect on wage. So military service clearly is endogenous. And Angrist has this really clever instrument, which is the Vietnam Draft Lottery. So what happened there? There was a war in Vietnam, as you all know, and there was a lottery. Yeah, so kind of they wanted to have a fair process to draft young men into the military. So every birthday in the year, so from January the 1st to December 31, got a number, yeah? And this number was kind of drawn by a lottery. So for instance, like for January 1, you would go to the lottery, you would draw like 83. Yeah? For January 2, you would draw the lottery 156. And then at the end, every date has a number, and you would say, okay, everyone that has a number, every birth date less than 200, for instance, I don't know what was the actual number, is eligible to join the military. So these people could be drafted and the other ones were basically free. Okay, so yeah, so that was basically the thing. And again, of course, the relevance is very clear. If you have a number less than 200, your chance is much higher to go to the military than anyone that has a number higher than 200, because these people have a chance of 0. If you have lower than 200, there is a chance. However, of course, like there may be reasons to doubt the validity of the instrument. If, for instance, there's draft avoidance. Yeah? So, for instance, there is an effect of a low number in this lottery, which is your instrument. Yeah? So, your instrument, lottery number, is, for instance, correlated to education. Yeah? Because people, instead of going to the military, they go to college. Because that was one of these backdoors that if you go to college, you cannot be drafted. Yeah, so your instrument would increase your level of education. The level of education, of course, increases your wage, and therefore the instrument is not valid anymore. Yeah, okay, so I think Enquist actually does something about this. So he has a good argument that this is not the case. Yeah, so he shows that in the data that is not happening, but that would be valid criticism here. And again, Enquist, yeah. Enquist, also Alan Kruger, also extremely good papers by Alan Kruger. They have another attempt at looking at the effect of education on wages, and the instrument that they use is quarter of birth. Now, what are they doing? In the US, in most states, there is some mandatory schooling law. Yeah? So kind of you have to stay in school until you're 16. Once you're 16, you can say, I leave, whatever. But until then, you have to stay in school. Now, this is important because you don't enter the school necessarily at the same age, right? That's kind of like the picture that we have here. So for instance, if you're born in December, you turn 6 and then you start school somewhat like in the middle of the year. However, if you're born in January, you turn 6 and then you start school much later. So you see that someone that wants to drop out at 16 and is born in January stays in school only kind of basically shorter than someone that wants to drop out at 16 and that is born in December. Yeah, so this is again about the relevance. So whether you're born in the first quarter or in the last quarter of the years is actually correlated with your level of education. Yeah. Now again, the validity rests on the randomness of the birth date. Yeah? So kind of like no one can actually choose their date of birth, and therefore it seems plausible here. It's difficult to come up with channels that may interfere with the validity here. Now, Enquist and Kruger, they do some interaction here, some fancy stuff, and they actually use two-stage least squares with 150 instruments. Now, this study is not so much criticized nowadays. So you see it's quite old, 30 years. It's not so much criticized nowadays because of the instrument, but rather because of what they do here with this interaction. So they have 150 instruments, but the instruments, some people claim, are actually rather weak. So their correlation with education is very low, close to 0. And therefore, these instruments may not be good enough. They may lead to the weak instruments problem. Okay, so that's basically it for the update. Yeah, there may be a slide or two in the middle that are also new, but I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, that's it. Bye-bye.